Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. Today we are welcoming to the podcast Professor Rob Larson, who teaches economics at Tacoma Community College in Washington, if I'm not mistaken. And we are having him on to discuss his book, Mastering the Universe. Quite an extensive subtitle. As a subtitle connoisseur / I always forget to read it in the introduction, but the subtitle is The Obscene Wealth of the Ruling Class, What They Do with Their Money, and Why You Should Hate Them Even More.
As far as subtitles go, it's a snappy one. I like it.
I like that, you're sort of presupposing your audience a little bit, to say, like, why you should hate them. Okay, we're making an argument how you should hate them even more. It's like, I'm picking this up as a dedicated ruling class hater, and I'm going to learn why.
No wonder I liked it so much. I'm the target audience.
Yeah, I hope that people will read it in a playful manner.
This I will say, up top that this is not, despite Rob being an economist and economics professor, this is not Paul Samuelson's economics textbook type of writing. This is lively. This is interesting. This has even curse words in it. Don't tell your mother.
Yeah, it's PG-13,
It's accessible and playful, more fun than the usual economics, but it's for everyone. That's right.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
So to kick us off here, we're talking about the ruling class, and basically we're talking in that context, basically the people that own all of the things, or mostly all of the things. And so, tell us about inequality and why, you go into it a little bit in the book, but why you're focusing on wealth inequality versus income inequality and what that means.
Oh, sure. That's a great question to start with. Yeah. Before we get into like the insane pleasure yachts and stuff, like it deserves to take a moment to look at the actual like figures and the amount of money that we're talking about here. And it is true. Like in the book, I do focus more on wealth rather than income. So, for people who don't live in the world of investing, income is a flow. Wealth is like a pool. You earn income and it pools into your wealth. If you have a lot of debt, we count that as negative wealth. Which one of these important measures you use to evaluate, the economy and chop it up into pieces, is a subjective thing. You can make a case for different bits. It is a lot easier to use income inequality data just because that information is always more easily available and it's more detailed and it goes back farther in history. Wealth reconstructions are harder to do and take more time. But I would say it is the more important thing. Your income obviously is important, and obviously it's related to your wealth. But the amount of wealth you have is what really matters. I mean, many people are, retired and are on fixed, not very large incomes. But if you've worked your whole life and you have a giant pool of wealth, that can work out just fine. So fundamentally, wealth is like, what you're standing on and what you have to support yourself with. So I think it's a more meaningful metric to keep track of the economic divergence of households in our society. But looking at it, I mean, people will know like the very basic trends, wealth and income inequality have both grown a large amount over the last 40, 45 years of what people like to call the neoliberal era of economic history. But wealth is always more dramatically concentrated than income. Which I think is important. And wealth also includes a lot of different components. With income, you're talking about certain amounts of dollars and from different kinds of sources, different kinds of labor or passive income, which we should also talk about. But when we talk about wealth, the most interesting component of it is it's not just like cash and big bank balances, although obviously those are real. You have a lot of physical assets. These families usually own their own home outright. I mean, just right there. Imagine owning your own home. I'm one of the lucky ones in the middle class. So I have a mortgage. most middle and working class people spend their lives saving up just a down payment to get a bank to loan you the rest of the money through a mortgage on a house. Talking about these families, you own your house and probably a couple places. So you have a place for the summer and the winter to avoid the unpleasant seasons, and they're yours. They're your property. Just a completely different economic reality just on that simple basis. I mean, most people, whether you can keep your house is like the big economic existential question. Like, oh, do you hear the Johnsons? She got sick or he lost his job and they're losing their home. Just owning homes is itself a very different picture. But fundamentally with wealth, the thing that we economists often say is important is that productive wealth, that physical capital, as we like to say, the factories and chemical plants and oil refineries and agricultural estates and giant data centers. Those things are those are wealth. Those are assets you can buy. Corporations and millionaires who own the corporations, they own those assets, but they give you the ability to control production in society. And that means a lot of employment is bound up in that as well. And of course, it gives you the ability to decide what gets invested in when you control a lot of society's wealth and what the tomorrow's economy will look like. So those are some of the just basic parts of the landscape we like to talk about.
It might be a good place since we're talking about that, because you have such a nice, simple definition of capitalism and socialism. And I'm sure we'll get to the plan at the end to combat all the ills and evils of these nasty characters and what they've done over history. But speaking of productive wealth, maybe you could distinguish between productive property versus, as you say, petty, private, or personal property, and why that distinction matters so much for growing inequality and for the political and economic social power.
Yeah, that's a great one, man. Definitely. When you talk to people who are in the political mainstream, people who are more conservative or more liberal, they're going to refer to socialism in scary terms, and they'll refer to it as being tyrannical, which is kind of funny if you look at the history of it. But primarily, like the first thing that conservatives always refer to is like, socialists, they're coming and they're going to take my gun and my truck and my gas burning stove. They're going to come and take my pants and my pets and my toothbrush. Like no one wants your petty personal property.
They're going to come for your truck nuts. They're going to take your...
We connect literally castrating the working class. It's about productive wealth that we usually talk about. I mean, your personal money, your little petty middle class house and cars. I mean, you're drawing on social services. You should pay a tax assessment to fund those. I mean, sure. But this is not like the wealth of society. When we talk about socializing the means of production or nationalizing capital, we're talking about those big pieces of productive capital that I mentioned a moment ago. Again, like housing stock is kind of intermediate. Usually a lot of socialists like to draw the line at expropriating your second home and up. But if, you're working on your mortgage on your home, I mean, you paid for it with your actual working class labor. That's not it's not because you have a personal house or condo unit that the working class is oppressed. It's because we have tiny ownership of all the productive capital of society. And it puts those owners in a position to decide who gets a job or not. It's like, that's a real distinction. And that's very different from, if Bernie is president, is he going to take away my Xbox? He won't. It's productive property we care about. That's the important thing, and just to kind of connect it to Ryan's first question about wealth, because I just feel this one point is so important. So I'm always kind of lunging to make it. One thing I mentioned in the chapter on wealth itself and the numbers in the book is, we talk about different kinds of wealth and owning it. The main thing that makes up the giant fortunes of the real high end of the wealth distribution and the ruling class, as it were, it's financial assets. And that includes things like bonds and, every kind of financial tool from, derivatives to, futures contracts to everything else. But the big thing is ownership of that corporate property, that big capital we mentioned. And we should just mention that, the oil refineries, the data centers, those things belong to corporate America. They're corporate property. They belong to Microsoft or Chevron or whichever. Well, those corporations, and we on the left have a long history of being skeptical of these powerful corporations and their incredible ability to control political events and so on. We should just recognize too, though, that those corporate empires have owners. They belong to their equity investors. They're shareholders, and shareholders are very tightly concentrated across the economy. So whereas if I can just turn to some wealth data here. All the data I'm referring to here is from the WID, the Wealth Inequality Database, which is a great resource that everyone listening should check out. You can pull up the World Inequality Database. It includes all of your hotshot economists who study the wealth gap. Piketty, Zuckerman, Saez. If you know who I'm talking about, you'll be very excited. If not, that's okay. Very good data visualization. See the share of income held by the rich versus like the bottom 50%. And they have that distribution visualized for your convenience for almost every individual country in the world. So you can pull up like Algeria or South Africa or Bolivia or Canada's wealth or income distributions over time. Pretty cool. So I just want to plug them since I'm stealing all of their work. So they found that the US in 2021, last year we had numbers for, the wealthiest 1% of households owned about 35% of wealth, which is an outrageous crime against human spirit. So that's bad. However, I would point out that same richest 1% of households owns 40% of all stock, of all that corporate equity and those traded stock assets, 40%. And the richest 10% of households own 84% of it, like most of it. Now, if you're like some, professional class person like myself, a community college professor, you may have a full-time job that may come with a tax-advantaged retirement vehicle of some type. Mine does. And when you sign up for the job, you get a little retirement plan and you pick basically a mutual fund, which a mutual fund, you can buy shares in a fund and they own shares of companies. So it's shares of something real. This is what finance is all about. If you're excited by this, you should go into finance, listeners. But the point is, all that big capital and productive wealth we're talking about, it's corporate property of this same ruling class. That's all. I just feel like sometimes people don't necessarily have that connection between the super rich households and billionaires and the giant global corporate empires that they disproportionately own. People like me may own little shreds of stocks, and I have a modest little retirement plan there. But it's a minority of households, and we certainly own a strong minority of the stocks. So I just want to mention that we talk about petty property. Petty property is important, your comforts of life. The productive property is represented by ownership of an investment portfolio and representing a bunch of real productive wealth. So I think that's the distinction people should see. Are we talking about your personal wardrobe in your closet or this portfolio that means you own half of South Africa? Like, that's a real distinction. One
thing I think of reading this book and talking about wealth inequality versus income inequality is the ProPublica piece. I'm not sure if you mentioned it in the book. I was reading rather quickly, but they got the tax returns of a bunch of super rich people, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and so on, and they calculated how much tax they were paying, and it was I think Elon Musk actually was paying the most tax at like 3% or something, and Jeff Bezos was paying nothing, almost nothing, to the extent in 1 year he actually claimed the child tax credit because his income was so low that he was under the threshold of, $150,000 or whatever it is. Like thanks means testing, but like this represents how the rich have structured the way that they receive their gigantic share of the corporate, the social surplus, like I would like to call it, the wealth of society, all the productive effort that goes into economic production every day. They don't take it in income, quote unquote. They take it in stocks and options and dividends and so on, this big pile of assets. And then they borrow against the volume of those assets so that they can get the income, the cash money in hand to go and rent, yachts and strippers and mansions and whatever else the things that they might want to have, and so in that way, if you could, especially in the American context, there's the step up basis, basically like if you give those assets to your children, they don't have to pay taxes on how they've appreciated over the lifetime that you've owned them. They just get basically a gimme, and they would have to pay taxes only on the value of when they receive them now. And so that delta, that however much those things have appreciated over your lifetime of several decades, one would hope, if you're a rich person, that's just totally untaxed. And, it's just like wealth and income are sort of important, the sort of conceptual categories, but you see how they play with these definitions in the legal system to advantage themselves. And at the end of the day, all it is like getting as much for yourself, giving as little as possible to the government, and giving as much as possible to yourself and to your progeny. And the way, like, they've just rigged the system to a preposterous degree.
Yeah, it's pretty stunning. It is true to see like the amount of social infrastructure that goes into sheltering this money for them. Like those tax returns on those like brand name billionaires are pretty stunning. Yeah, low enough taxable income that you can claim, tax exemptions intended for like blue collar people and single mothers and stuff like that. That's showing that your actual giant regular income to sustain your giant lifestyle, Jeff Bezos's gigantic yacht and so forth, shows it's got, a hyper tax advantage status because it wasn't those tax levels weren't envisaged as your taxes on people's loans against their giant capital assets. Yeah, and then your ability to pass it on with that single tax blow is another amazing part of it. I just always think of those Panama Papers and the related big disclosures about it's just an enormous amount of legal infrastructure that exists to just shield some rich douchebag's huge fortune from whatever tax jurisdiction he technically inhabits or, where his main residence is theoretically located. It's pretty amazing to see that stuff. I mean, by now, I mentioned this briefly in the book. We're very familiar with how much corporate entities and their wealthy, equity owners can massage government policy in this way. I talk a little bit about Citizens United and the famous Supreme Court case that eventuated that. And in the super PAC era, it's just a much more unlimited playground for people with this kind of money to pour assets in. And yet, this tax bracket is mostly for people who are gig workers. We should lower it. It'll be good for investment. This is actually how I take all of my income because of some hilarious scheme that my lawyer came up with at some point. And I gave him a bonus $1 million for it. Pretty stunning stuff, And it's because we're working so hard to put these people in this position.
That's the end of the preview, folks. As usual, we like to mention that this podcast is sponsored by the American Prospect magazine. So if you want to listen to the whole thing, you can subscribe at $5 a month. If you want that plus a free subscription to the website, plus the opportunity for a steeply discounted print subscription, you can do that if you so wish at $10 a month. And otherwise, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.